Thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to be here, and of course I should thank Chris and Matt and the staff here at the OI for inviting me and for making me feel quite so welcome. We had a wonderful dinner just before this, and I've been coming to the OI now for almost 20 years. My first visit, I was invited by Gil Stein, who was then the director, because I had written him an email. And I said, I'm very interested in world systems theory, and I'd like to talk to you about its relevancy to the economic development of Bronze Age societies in the Middle East. I was a very serious student at once upon a time. But Gil was wonderful and invited me into his director's office, and I was a quivering, 20-something, whatever, 20-year-old. And he spent a good hour with me, and I'll never forget that. Because, I'm sure, Chris, you do the same with students who just show promise and interest and maybe are slightly annoying, and you say, okay, fine, come in and let's talk. But anyway, so the OI has always been a special place for me, and this is my first time lecturing here, so I'm thrilled you're all here to witness my downfall. Many of you may have come because you saw National Geographic and you thought, oh, that's interesting, and some of you have come because you said, where's Oman, and you wanted to learn more about that. So I do wear two hats, literally and figuratively. And my role at National Geographic, I'm happy to tell you more about at the reception afterwards, if you're interested. It's a very, very complicated place, both nonprofit and for-profit, and I roam around multiple sides of that institution. But today I wanted to talk about my research, which I don't often get to talk about, so it's kind of thrilling for me. I've been working in Oman now since 2007. There's very few archaeological teams working in Oman, so it was very easy to quickly become the expert. And the Omanis are really wonderful people and don't have a lot of capacity in country. So by simply offering to help, quickly became really close collaborators on a lot of the heritage issues that Oman is facing today with development and other things. And I was just there about a month ago, and it's just a great place. I recommend it to all of you, and hopefully after this talk you'll be inspired. So, where is Oman? We're in southeastern Arabia. I usually tell people Oman is east of Dubai, and then they all go, oh yeah, I know where that is. Oman is a surprising place. It's a very mountainous country through most of the north. It has an enormous coastline, beautiful beaches, a very unusual culture today, unlike its neighbors. It has a different type of Islam called Ibadism, which we can talk about later. But a very, very unique culture, linguistically, religiously, culturally, and I always highly recommend it. Now, in the Bronze Age, particularly in the 3rd millennium BC, this is kind of what the world looked like, right? This was the world system, as Gil would have said many years ago. And you have here Mesopotamia, of course, in Iraq. And these place names headed to the south and east come from Mesopotamian texts of the 3rd millennium that talk about trading partners, sometimes other nations they went to battle with and this sort of thing. A lot of that is just hype. But basically they talk about these places, and for a long time scholars tried to figure out, okay, where are these places and who are they talking about, and how do we match that with the archaeology? Here's for, the classic example that everyone points to, and this is from Sargon the Great, talking about the ships from Dilmun, the ships from Magan, the ships from Maluha, and how he made them, forced them to come to his port. I'm sure they really twisted their arm to come trade with the Mesopotamians. But it's interesting that one of the ways that they figured out where these places were is that they were always in that order, right? So they always went Dilmun first, then Magan, and then Maluha. And today most scholars acknowledge Dilmun as the area of Bahrain and that part of the Saudi coastline there, maybe a bit of Qatar. Magan is the Emirates and northern Oman, and Maluha is what we now call the Indus Valley civilization. And most scholars accept that as truth. Dilmun we know actually quite a bit about. There's a lot of texts about Telmun or Dilmun, both religious texts, mythical texts. It was the Garden of Eden, right, for the Sumerians and the Akkadians, was sort of the place where life began. It was a holy place. It was also a trading partner, and it was a very important trading partner for thousands of years. Sort of the main entrepot controlling the sea trade as it went up to southern Iraq from the Gulf. So, decades and decades of excavation in Bahrain in particular really unveiled the early pearling culture there. The pearls were obviously a very important part. But the most important thing in Bahrain was actually fresh water. So it's a natural source of fresh water in the region, which is, of course, they had these freshwater oases springing out of the desert, very romantic. And of course, that's where this sort of concept of the beginnings of life and all of this holy waters came from. Magan is not so clear. And there's a number of historical reasons for this. The key one being, of course, Magan was closed to foreigners until the 1970s, with the current sultan overthrew his father in a bloodless coup with the help of the British and opened the doors for the first time. And this was a medieval, fiefdom nation. I mean, people still living the way they had lived in the 16th and 17th century, suddenly thrown into the late 20th century. And there's a whole lecture I could give about the sort of rapid globalization and modernization of Oman from the 70s to now. It's really, really dramatic. And as an anthropologist, it's fascinating. But in the Bronze Age, we didn't really know much about it, even to the point when I got there in 2007, despite decades since the 1970s of people working there, nobody could actually point to where is Magan. They would just say, well, it's the Emirates in Oman, the Bronze Age, this sort of thing. I said, well, it was a coastal nation. They talk about the ships of Magan. Was this really a coastal thing? Oh, yeah, definitely coastal, definitely coastal. So anyway, a friend and I went romping around on the back of a Jeep, Bob Adams style, and just went looking for sites that had Bronze Age monuments, and that's what we plotted there. And you'll notice that there are very few on the coast. Right? And the big uns are all in that interior part. And so one of the first things that we did as part of the project was to say, well, if you're going to say where are the large centers of ancient Magan, they're not on the coast. They're in the interior. And those mountains that you can sort of see the topography are very high. These are very high mountains. They have snow in the winter. In the summer, it can be like 55 degrees centigrade, which is like 120 degrees Fahrenheit or something absurd. It's an incredibly hot part of the world, and yet the mountains are so high they can have snow. So this was an area that the center of Magan was really hidden behind the mountains, if you want to think about it that way. Now, historically, that's also interesting, thinking about geography. National Geographic, I have to go there. Thinking about geography. In historical times, these were the trade routes that were known to go through the mountain passes between the coast and the interior, bringing dried fish and other seafood products into the interior and exchanging them for dates, for pastoral things like sheep and goat and that kind of stuff, crops generally, which were grown on the interior, and these were the normal trade routes in historical periods. Well, what's interesting is, although we think about the Persian Gulf trade to Mesopotamia as very driven by the sea trade, many experts in seafaring, I am not one of them, tell me that the Straits of Hormuz is not an easy place to take a ship. It's actually very shallow, it's very rocky. The coastlines on both sides of the Straits of Hormuz have very little fresh water. They're very inhospitable to life even today. So if you're taking small Bronze Age vessels from, let's say, the Indus Valley civilization to Mesopotamia, going through the Straits of Hormuz is not an easy task. I'm sure it happened. But it is also possible that Magan played an important role as a place of portage, as a place where products would come to the Omani coast, maybe where it says Sohar, for example, and they would portage across the land. It's actually not that, today you can drive that in about 2-3 hours. It's not that far, and it's very flat and pretty easy, to the other side and to get into other boats to take up to Mesopotamia. It's possible. This is all stuff to be worked out. So why was Magan important other than as a place of portage? Well, we know from the text that certain products were coming from Magan. One of them is diorite, so that statue there. It's a very hard black stone. Diorite is found in Oman in the mountains. Soft stone vessels, so what we traditionally call soapstone or chlorite, steatite, any of those. Large sources of soapstone are found in Oman. But the most important product was this. Does anyone know what that is? It looks like a cow patty, right? It's not a cow patty. They did not export dung. That's a copper ingot. It's called a bun-shaped ingot. The copper of Magan was the most important product of this area, according to text. And we have lots of archaeological evidence that a significant amount of copper production was being done. This was the Pittsburgh of the Bronze Age world, right? The third millennium. In the second millennium, so after this early Bronze Age system sort of shuts down, I'm sure many of you know about the collapse, and it's not really collapse, but anyway, at the end of the third millennium, does anyone know where the major copper center becomes? Mediterranean? Cyprus, right? And the oxhide ingots, right? That all kicks off in sort of the early to mid second millennium when Oman stops producing huge amounts of bun-shaped ingots, which are found all over the known world. So it's an interesting thing. You see this shift to Mediterranean, and you see Mesopotamia itself shift westward at that time. So it's, you know, I'm not saying copper rules the world, but copper rules the world. So anyway, in Oman, we find lots of evidence of production of these bun-shaped ingots, which were being sold down the line to make these beautiful products like, you know, the bullhead of Ur and, you know, these sorts of things, these bronzes and copper artifacts. Almost all of that copper at this time was coming from either small deposits, small production centers in Iran, Turkey, or the large mass production that's going on in Oman at that time. And it's a scale issue. So let me situate you. Okay, so many of you probably are familiar with Mesopotamia and the sort of standard sequence. It's, you know, you have the Neolithic arises, you know, 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, farming, sheep herding, you know, goats, these sorts of things. And then they start developing complex cities and civilization. You get irrigation, mass irrigation leads to bigger cities. And then you get writing and you get all of this wonderful stuff that you all know from the OI. Go walk through the galleries and you'll see it, right? That is the sequence that we think of for the ancient Near East. And we tend to use Mesopotamia as that sort of guiding light. Oman doesn't do that at all. What we have in Oman is basically a hunter-gatherer / pastoral lifestyle, very limited pastoralism, all the way until about 3000 BC, so about 5,000 years ago, when Mesopotamia is in full throttle with cities and writing and governments, and Egypt is becoming, you know, the pre-dynastic is kicking off, and you're going to go off into the dynastic and build massive pyramids. Suddenly, at about 3000 BC, almost overnight, you see this shift. And suddenly they're living in small villages in Oman with farming, sheep, goat, wheat, barley, dates, and they're settled and they're building monuments. Now they're not the Giza pyramids or the ziggurats, but they're monuments, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And then they go through the third millennium. They're very wealthy because of this copper production, the diorite, the soapstone, and they go into the second millennium BC in what's here called the Wadi Suk period, and there's some kind of collapse. When the whole system breaks down, they also break down, although new evidence is showing that that's, of course, not true, and we can talk about that later over a drink. All right. I'm zooming through a decade, so you gotta bear with me here, right? I'm trying to speed it up. Okay, so here's where we are. Here's the site of Bat. Bat is one of the largest centers of the third millennium in this region. It's both in square kilometers, but also in its remains. It has it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site because it has more standing monuments from the third millennium BC than any other site in all of southeastern Arabia. I actually think it has more monuments of the Bronze Age than all the other sites combined. Of one period where I'll show you some pictures. For example, here, these tombs you see on the left, the ones on the bottom have been partially reconstructed, the ones at the top have not. So we find these open tombs still standing today. They've not been touched, they've not been reconstructed. The ones on the bottom, they did some silly stuff on them. But anyway, they're still standing, and there are over 500 of them at Bat alone. Some of the least preserved ones, we have thousands and thousands. This was a major, major center, certainly for constructing tombs, but we also have what are called towers. And that's what we're going to talk about today. These monumental towers you see on the right, they're found throughout ancient Magan. They're generally round. They're 20 to 25 meters in diameter, somewhere between 50 and 60 feet in diameter. They tend to be made of monumental stone. They're very enigmatic. Obviously, we have no writing in ancient Magan, so we don't know what they were for exactly. All of them have a well in the middle. You'd think, oh, well, protecting water sources, wonderful. Yeah, well, they have wells on the outside of them too, amongst the domestic houses, which is generally built right up against the towers. So we now generally think of them as platforms. We think they were platforms on which either religious structures, sort of elite structures, like an elite house, or potentially some kind of fortification was built on top of them. And unfortunately, whatever was built on top has been wiped away years ago. But these large monuments are interesting because nobody had ever really investigated them before. So people, since the 1970s, working in Oman, and many esteemed names in Near Eastern archaeology fled to Oman when the revolution happened in Iran, and they get kicked out of Afghanistan and Pakistan, all these places, and they fled to Oman because it was easy. It was pleasant. There was no war. The Omanis are lovely people. They're very welcoming. So people came here and they spent the rest of their careers here, and what they did is they dug tombs. And so they would excavate these tombs like you see at the top left, because of course in the tombs they find all the fun things, right? Tombs are where the goodies are, and these are standing tombs, so you don't even have to dig down, right? It's pretty easy, you just have to kind of clear them out. Unfortunately, they're multiple use tombs, so many of these tombs have 50, 60, 70 burials associated with them. Some of them have hundreds of burials associated with them that can span hundreds of years. So what ended up happening to the archaeology of the region is that we would define the periods, define the archaeology based on the tomb types. So we had 3 periods, each one lasted at least 500 years, and they were entirely homogeneous. Now, if you know anything about archaeology, you know that that's not possible. People don't live in a homogeneous way for 500 years without changing. And so it was always a problem in the archaeology of Oman that if you came to me and you said, here, I found this potsherd, can you tell me when it's from? I could say, well, it's somewhere between 2800 and 2000 BC. Well, that's a very long time in the 3rd millennium. If we were in the Paleolithic, that would be brilliant. But it's not. And so it was very unhelpful. It was very hard to pull connections with other cultures and other civilizations. So what we did in 2007 is we were invited to come to Bat, to their prized World Heritage Site, and start excavating some of these towers. And the reason we went to the towers is because we were hoping for stratigraphy, right? We were hoping to find a sequence of building and construction, but also material culture. Really basic stuff. All of you know archaeology know this. So we started digging. Well, I didn't dig, I was important, so I got to stand there and make them dig. But we started digging, and it proved to be way more interesting than we had thought. So Bat itself has about 8 towers, and over a 6-year period, we excavated 4 of them. First thing we found out is they were not all contemporary. So the towers were built, and they were used for probably about 100, 150 years, and then they were abandoned. In some cases, they were actually kind of torn down to build a tower nearby. And what that did was, it was great. So again, talking about sequence, once we got radiocarbon dates and material culture, and we could say, wait a minute, this tower only dates to 3000 to 2800 BC. For the first time in Omani archaeology ever, we were able to say, this pottery is from this early period. And that was for us, a really big deal. It really helped us out. We also learned a lot about their construction. They were constructed often in multiple phases. In some cases, they were associated with water and irrigation. In some cases, they were high up on sort of a defensive pinnacle. They were built on rock, overlooking the valley. And interesting, thinking about those wells, they still had wells in the middle of them that were dug into rock. And there was no water. So again, thinking about these wells, that maybe they were ritual of some kind, maybe they were for putting deposits in. If they're up on a hillside, maybe it's a cistern for collecting water. We actually have one of the towers we excavated. When we got to the outside of the tower, we started seeing that there were these there was a ditch clearly dug around it. Again, we're on top of a rocky hillside, right? There's no alluvium or anything. So there's this beautiful sandy ditch going around it with steps. And so we go down a step and you're like, okay, and then you continue around the tower, round tower, and there's another step. And we went through 3 of these steps, and at the bottom there was a cistern which was lined with slabs of stone and plastered and everything else. And we're looking at this and we're like, what the heck? I mean, you know, are they taking water from somewhere? I mean, where's all this coming from? And later on we found out, we had invited a geomorphology team, so experts in fluvial dynamics and sedimentation and everything, to come look at the site. And they said, well, first of all of the sediment up here is brought here by people. There's no natural way the sediment got here, so they brought it up. Secondly, this thing that you're looking at is a cascade for when it rained, the 2 or 3 times of the year. The rain would hit the hillside, trickle down into this, cascade around the tower, and end up in the cistern. Wow. So that was very different from what we thought we were going to find. It showed a level of hydraulic engineering that we never expected. This is a stateless society. I should point out, in the graves, there's no evidence of an elite at all. All of the graves are exactly the same. Everybody is buried with the same number of pots and the same amount of jewelry. Everything is the same, right? So it's very difficult to see any kind of state-level society, and yet they're building huge monumental structures with very complex hydrology, making this, of course, a very interesting case example for those of us who study the non-state societies of the Middle East. And if you want to learn more, you can read it. It's very technical. Brace yourself. But we're very proud. We got it out just last year. And as Chris mentioned, we have another one that's on its way, which is about the settlement work that I'll show you a little bit about. So this really focuses on those monuments. And believe it or not, it is the first technical monograph ever published of a prehistoric site in Oman. So we've sort of tried to set a bar for what scholars should be doing in the region, because publishing what you do is very important, as everybody here knows. Now, the other surprising thing about the towers, the reason people never dug the towers is they said, well, there's nothing in them. They're very boring. We should go dig the tombs because you find all the good stuff. So we said, well, maybe we don't care. So we're going to go dig them anyway. And we did find good stuff. We found some wonderful Indus pottery, which has only ever been found at places like Mohenjo-Daro. And strangely, we found 1 sherd of it. Some wonderful arrowheads. This is, oh, sorry. I love this one. I was telling John Alden about this over dinner. So this here is a sort of classic Mesopotamian Jemdet Nasser early dynastic 1-2 sherd, dated around, let's say, 2900, 2800 BC. I actually used the OI collection for this, and one of the students who worked on the project, Royal Ghazal, was a student here at the University of Chicago, and he has these sherds here in Chicago. So anyway, this is a sort of typical Mesopotamian import. That was not a huge surprise. What was a surprise was this little guy. This is exactly the same shape. It looks the same, sort of when you look at it. It's got the same greenish buff, they usually call it. It's kind of this sort of pukey color. That's actually a slip. It's painted to look like this one. Right? So it's painted to look like a Mesopotamian one. The shape is the same, but it is completely, it's a local fabric. It's this really terribly made ceramic. Typical sort of local imitation of a foreign import, right? What's exciting about it is it's actually the earliest evidence of ceramic production ever in Oman, because the Omanis didn't make pottery until about 2600 BC. In traditional textbooks, if you ever look at Omani archaeology, and this is dated 2900, and it is clearly local when you look at it as a ceramicist. So that was very exciting. That's very boring and technical. I'll tell you this story because it's a little bit more fun. This was found in a hoard of beads that were mainly Iron Age beads. That's a New Kingdom scarab seal, if you can't see it. Now, what is a New Kingdom scarab seal doing in Oman? Right? And it was found in this hoard of Iron Age beads in an Islamic context on top of one of the towers. And our assumption is that these were looted from a Iron Age tomb somewhere in the vicinity and stored probably under somebody's house or something like that and forgotten about. They were found all sort of together. But anyway, we were very excited. I mean, how many times do you find a New Kingdom scarab seal when you're working in Oman? So we went to the ministry at the end of the season, bringing all of our finds, and we had it in this beautiful little, glass case, and we were so excited, and we did the whole, like, whip it out from behind your back to say, look what we found. And they said, oh, what is it? And we said, here, look at it. It's a New Kingdom scarab seal from Egypt. And the guy looked at it and he goes, oh, yeah, I have a whole drawer full of those. And he goes, and he pulls open the drawer, and they've got like 7 of them, I was like, well, where do those come from? He's like, oh, tombs and around and around. And I'm just like, those are Egyptian. And he goes, yeah. Okay. Anyway, we made them promise to put them on display. So if you go to Muscat, the new National Museum, there's a little case with all the scarab seals, including that one. But anyway, goes to show, don't get too cocky, right? So another thing that we did that I'm very proud of, so we excavated this tower. You could see the internal walling, you could see the well, these massive walls. That's one wall, so 5 meters in diameter, going around. These look like rooms. They're not rooms. There's no doorways. There's no floors. There's nothing in them. And you see out here, you start getting the beginning of houses and other structures, which is a whole nother lecture. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to find a place where we could go down, right? Remember I mentioned we were looking for stratigraphy. We wanted to see the layers on top of each other, which we could date and get material culture to really establish a sequence for Oman in the 3rd millennium. And so we went here, and we decided to open up what's called a deep sounding, right? Where you just open up one area and you just go down until you hit China. So the reason we went here, the site was originally excavated in the 70s and 80s by a Danish archaeologist named Karen Freefeld, who, believe it or not, is still alive today. She's 102 or 101, bless her heart. And she excavated just a very limited sondage, only about 1 meter or 2 wide and like 25 meters long, going from the inside of the tower all the way outside. She just wanted to see what was there. And this is the section that she published, which, shows all of her layers and blah, blah, blah. But what struck me when I looked at this section, so here's the tower wall. The tower today is surrounded by alluvium, which to most people doesn't seem like a weird thing, except if you know Oman, it rains 2 times of the year. There is no alluviation. What alluviation, right? There's no rivers. So where is this amount of alluviation coming from, right? Question number 1. Question number 2 for me is, okay, so here's the tower wall, right? That's the scale, so that's 1 meter. So this is like almost 3 meters high, and we're digging down 2 meters into the soil here. There's the bottom of the tower. What the heck is that? Right? So that excited me. So I said, okay, well, we're going to go and we're going to see what we can find. And sure enough, we open up the deep sounding and we go down, and you find, walls. Here, I'll make it easier for you. Okay? Now, why is that exciting? The tower dates, as I said, to the Bronze Age, to this middle of the 3rd millennium BC, typical of many of the towers. The earliest period, like I mentioned, of settled farming happened, as I said, almost overnight around 3000 BC, right? Like almost overnight, bang, farming, sheep, goat, wheat, barley, dates, etc. We had never found a settlement of that period, only tombs. The only settlement that had ever been found was one tower actually in the Emirates, a site called Hilly, and a French team had excavated there, and they had found the wheat and the barley and the sheep and the goat, and they didn't really have houses, they just had this one tower that they had excavated. And that's what we knew about this period, about this earliest farming villages, these earliest settlements. And so here underneath the tower, about 3 meters down, we managed to find one. Well, that's super helpful. So we in seasons that followed, we've tried to find more of it. It is buried under about 3 meters of very clay-heavy alluvium, which is not fun to dig if you've ever tried. And then many of the walls are mud brick, and so they're a very clayey mud brick with no chaff in a clay matrix of clay. So that is something for future technologies to try to help us out. But it was exciting for us because for the first time we could prove these were not sort of nomadic hunter-gatherers. These were a settled society, as had been argued, but never proven. So because of that alluviation I mentioned, we invited that geomorphology team, right? So we invited the team who specializes in fluvial dynamics and sedimentation and all that good stuff. Physical geography is another way to say that. And so here they are studying one of the sections. Now, that's a natural section in the sense that it's sort of natural alluviation, but of course there is archaeological material in it. This is a natural road cut, by the way, which is what of course made it a beautiful section because you just have to clean it up. Here you see these are mud bricks. That is from that earliest village period. So that was very exciting, is that we found it again in the section. This is about 100 meters from that tower. So we were pretty confident that that whole landscape from the tower all the way to the hillside, which you could see there, was probably a village of that period. And again, hopefully technologies in the future will make it easier to access. But what was also exciting here, I think I have some circles. There you go. There's the mud bricks. What was also exciting was here. So what you're seeing here, this white level, that's a natural sort of lake bed from 7,000 to 8,000 years ago when this was still a very green, lush area, standing water, probably very marshy, creating a sort of shallow lake, and you get shell deposits and that kind of thing, and they make it white clay. So that's down here at the bottom, and then you start getting these. You see these stripes. This is sort of typical as a lake or a marsh is drying up. You'll get periods of drying, periods of wet, and so then it's black and then it's white. And that's all very natural, and it shows the drying up, which for them was very exciting, the natural environmental changes that happen here. But right at the top, right before it switches to being this typical alluviation, we did some micromorphology, which is you go and you take parts of the dirt and you look at it under a microscope. You look for things like evidence of human occupation, right? Little crushed bits of ceramic or charcoal or evidence of plowing and that kind of thing. And what we found is that if this is that earliest village, we're about half a meter lower than that, right at the cusp of the end of this natural striations. And what we found was evidence of human-controlled irrigation, that is, flooding episodes. And this has to do with shells they found. It's a whole complicated thing, but I can tell you over a drink. But basically what it suggests is that about 3,500, 3,400 BC, so in this gap period that we knew really nothing about, it wasn't overnight. That there was a period in which probably still fairly mobile pastoral groups are not quite farming yet. There's no evidence that they were farming. Maybe they were. But they're definitely controlling water. And they're not controlling water to drink, per se. They're controlling water because of the most important thing that natural water brings, which is what? Fertile soil, right? The Nile is not important because it's a source of fresh water. The Nile is important because it's a source of fertile sediment. For anyone who's ever been to Egypt, you know how dramatic the Nile role plays in separating the desert from what you can live in, right? And it's the same in Oman. So they were controlling water for sedimentation. And that's a really interesting new growth area that a lot of different groups in Oman are now exploring because it suggests it happened earlier than we had thought and before there was contact with Mesopotamia, which is a critical thing because the argument had always been that for some reason farmers from Mesopotamia decided to go and colonize Oman, which I always thought was a very strange thing for farmers to do. Anyway, so this is some of the new growth stuff that we're looking into is both the environmental changes and how humans adapted to those environmental changes through use of the landscape in new and innovative ways. So, having done monuments for about 6 years, I still felt that we didn't really understand who were these people, how did they live, what did they do. We knew their tombs, we knew their monuments, we know a lot about their health and biology from the skeletal samples, but we really didn't know much about how they lived, how they farmed, who were they. So I wanted to go find somewhere with settlement. I really wanted houses. I wanted to do a little domestic archaeology. And I don't know if, can any of you see the walling in there? You see some in the back pretty easily. That's actually an Islamic thing. But this here, I don't know if you can see that. This was an area that the Danish archaeologists very helpfully had called the settlement slope. So we thought, well, let's go start there. That should be good. And sure enough, it was. And we were quite pleased. You can see it's quite shallow. So we don't get a lot of deposit. This is where I was mentioning, by the way, that's the tower that has the cascade around it in the cistern. This is the hillside that when it rained, our geomorphologists suggest that water came down here, would hit this cascade and then hop around until it got in the cistern, just showing you where we are. So we're on top of a limestone low hill, right? We're up above whatever alluviation is happening. So any sedimentation we have up here is, if it's not brought in by the wind, it's man-made, right? You know, it's brought there by people. And this area here, for example, was this plot of very sandy sediment, which our geomorphologists, again, tell us was probably a garden. So here you have a house, entrances, some entrances blocked up, different phases of use with a little garden behind it, right? Sort of beautiful domestic archaeology. We just found somebody's house. And like any good house, it's full of trash, right? And as you all know, we archaeologists are, wait, are your houses not full of trash? Is that, no? Oh, sorry. We archaeologists really are experts in trash, right? That's what we do. We take trash and we analyze it, we understand it, and we make a lot out of it. You know, occasionally you get lucky. This is what I call a big find from the houses. This is a bronze sickle for farming. You know, and again, this is not a golden idol, right? It's not even a New Kingdom scarab seal. But for us, this was really exciting. Nobody had ever dug houses in the Bronze Age, right? It was always tombs. And if it wasn't tombs, you might dig a tower. We didn't know anything about the houses. We didn't know anything about their domestic life. So this has been a really exciting new step for us. A PhD student just finished at Johns Hopkins working on our project, has written literally the first thesis on domestic archaeology in the Bronze Age of Oman. You know, it's like light years behind everywhere else in the rest of the world in archaeology, but we're catching up. So we're very pleased to kind of push these boundaries a little bit. Another one of our PhD students, Smitty Nathan, just finished at NYU doing the first flotation for botanical samples ever done in the, you know, you're going to hear me say this over and over again. And, you know, for us, this is really exciting, right? For the archaeologists in the audience, you know this. You find a hearth with charcoal and seeds, this is a big day, right? And so we do our flotation, and obviously this is not a Bronze Age site. This is a 16th century village in Oman, but this is also my plug. Go visit Oman. It is gorgeous, and it's not going to stay this way forever. So if you want to see the way people lived in the 17th century in Arabia, this is it. But anyway, this is going to help us kind of reconstruct. This is how I think about the settlement slope up on that rocky hillside with the alluviation down here. Obviously, there weren't terraces in the Bronze Age, but this kind of situation, it really helps us to visualize how people lived and used their landscape over time. And this is really important at Bat, where in addition to the Bronze Age, we actually have remains all the way up until the present. So we've got Iron Age, and we've got early historic, and we've got medieval, and we've got late Islamic. And you know, this is the modern, well, it's the historic village of Bat, the mud brick village. And it was constructed probably in the 16th, 17th century when the Portuguese came and took over the coasts of Oman. A lot of the Omanis fled into the interior and built fortresses everywhere they went. They were terrified the Portuguese were coming. And of course, the Portuguese never bothered to go into the interior, but just in case they did, they built forts everywhere. So you have these beautiful mud brick forts everywhere, and they're beautifully preserved because, as I said, it rains 2 days a year, right? And not a lot. So they're in really, really good shape. But they are crumbling to dust. You know, when the Sultan took over in the 1970s, one of the first things he did is he decreed that all of his people would stop living in mud brick. And the government set about building lots and lots of cement buildings and moving everybody in. And those of you who work in the Middle East know this is one of the great disasters of the Middle East because, of course, mud brick houses set into date groves, semi-subterranean, are the coolest, most wonderful places to be when it is 52 degrees Celsius outside, right? They are natural air conditioning, and they're wonderful. And nowadays they live in cement, or nowadays they live in marble mansions that are like smack in the middle of the desert, no trees to be seen, and they're just getting full sun, and so they're blasting their air conditioning, you know, 24/7. It is a, you know, a disaster of multiple levels. But anyway, so these all of these sites were abandoned basically overnight. So we've actually partnered with a team from the University of Leicester who are doing a combination of historical archaeology and ethnohistory, and talking to the people of Bat, because many of them were born in the mud brick village, right? Many of the people who are today in their 50s, 60s, 70s, they remember living in these little mud brick homes with their 8 other siblings, 2 camels, 3 goats, and a donkey. And they all lived in a house together, and mom used to cook there, and we would sleep up on the roof here. I mean, that kind of information, as you all know, is so rare nowadays for historic structures. So we're able to do that now and work with them. What's exciting also about this sort of ethnohistory, historical archaeology project is suddenly the town got interested. So as soon as we started working not only on the prehistoric site, which occasionally people would show up and be like, what are you doing? What are you looking at? And you'd tell them, and they'd be like, okay, boring. And they'd walk away. As soon as we started working in the mud brick village and we started, conducting interviews with the people to say, please walk me through your village and tell me how you lived here. And they loved it. And of course we did it, gender segregated, right? So the women on our team would go with the women of the village in the morning, and they would go walk through, and they'd have a grand old time. They'd be whooping it up and laughing and dancing and all this stuff. And then we men would go with the men, and it was very formal, and everybody is walking, and yes, very pleasant and polite. So anyway, that goes to show you who actually has fun in the Middle East. Anyway, so what was great is suddenly we had a lot of interest. And so we realized that a lot of what we had to do was not focus so much on our research, but to focus on our outreach, right? And I mean, this is pretty obvious to many of you, but Omanis, at least the Omanis that we dealt with, were never interested. There's one Omani archaeologist in the whole world. One. And he got his PhD only about 6 years ago, right? They don't have a culture of interest in their own archaeology. They're not against it. They're not like looting it or anything. They're just like, oh yeah, there's some monuments. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, whatever. So seeing this interest, we jumped at it, right? And so we brought in some educational specialists and heritage specialists and started working on how do we get them more involved. And this really grew. So we were already proud that we were one of the few truly international teams working in Oman. So in Oman, you have the French team, and everybody on the French team is French. And then you have the German team, and everyone on the German team is German. And you got the Polish team, and you got this team, and then the British team, and that team. And then here comes the American team, and you've got Poles, Indians, French, Australians, Koreans, you name it. We were like, yeah, if you want to come, show up. We had 2 University of Chicago students. Anyone who wanted to come could come, no problem. So it was open door policy. If you could get yourself there, we would put you up, right? So we had these wonderfully diverse teams. But what we also started to do once the Omanis were becoming, one, better trained because they were working with us year after year after year, they became more interested. So Badr Ali was a farmer, a date farmer. He's illiterate. He can't even really write his name in Arabic. He uses a fingerprint. And he became one of our absolute best excavators. He was a really hard worker, and of course he was a farmer, so he knew the land, he knew the soil, and was really good at it. And so we really started giving him more and more opportunities, and now he is officially the site manager for BAT. He's the one with the keys, and he protects the monuments at BAT year-round. Brahim Nasser was working with me. His English was excellent, so the complete opposite of Badr Ali. He was totally literate in 2 languages, a very, very smart guy, but also very good at archaeology. And I wouldn't say he was interested, but he was curious. Well, any of you who teach students know that curious is better than not, right? So you seize upon curious and you try to find what are they interested in. And believe it or not, what he was interested in was paperwork. So, okay. So we had him helping us out as a lab manager and doing, helping with the inventory and all of that. And he did a great job, and he's now been hired by the ministry in Muscat. And he works officially in the Ministry of Heritage and Culture. And remember, this is the provinces, right? I mean, this is the villages, right? People in Muscat do not talk to these people, generally speaking. And he's now a rock star in the ministry. We're so proud. And this is my co-director, Charlotte Cable. And she worked with the women in the village. Women, of course, cannot work in the field. That would be culturally taboo. But women in Oman are very empowered. They are the dominant gender in universities and higher education. They work in ministries. They can be ministers. The ambassador to the United States is a woman, an Omani woman. So they're very empowered. And Charlotte trained a number of these young ladies, many of whom now work for the ministry as the heritage advisors and education outreach advisors. And they write, curricula in Arabic, in Omani Arabic, which is a very specific thing. and do outreach to schools and that kind of thing. So we're really, really proud. We got these people not only curious and then interested, but also tried to help them get actual skills so they can get actual jobs, right? And that was a really big part of where we started moving with the project. Long story short, you know, for me, the lesson, the take home was, while the monuments were great, and I learned a lot, as soon as we started working on the houses and we started looking at how did people live, and then we, you know, tried to look for historical analogies, right, to sort of say, well, how can this help us understand the use of the landscape? Suddenly, you know, this whole thing came alive, and we now, I feel, have a really robust community at BAT, the Omanis in particular, who are really interested in what we're doing. And when we go back, there's great fanfare and excitement, and they want to talk about, oh, I was digging in my garden and look what I found, and you know, all this stuff, which can be good or bad. But one of the interesting things at a site like BAT, it's a living site. You know, this is the view from here. I'm showing you the modern village, right? This is a living site with living heritage. And partly the most exciting part of this project is, obviously there's a lot more to do. There's all periods. So we have our work cut out for us. Probably I will not be doing it, being an administrator nowadays, a middle manager, the gruesome middle manager at National Geographic. But we've trained an army of PhD students and Omanis, and very proud that I think some of them are going to go on and take over this project, and I'll just show up and drink my gin and tonics the way I should be. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I'll take a few questions.